I'm Janci Patterson. This is my book, Chasing the Skip. It's contemporary young adult. I also do young adult science fiction. My agent has a book out on sub right now that's science fiction, so I do both. I'm going to talk mostly about YA. I was doing the math today. I realized I took this class from Brandon the first time he taught it. That was in 2004. So I've been doing this a long time. I've been writing for 14 years. I was having a little bit of a crisis today as I was doing that math. So I took this class, and I spent, at the time, Brandon had sold Elantris, and he was the only published writer that I knew. So I spent a lot of years believing that I needed to be just like Brandon in order to be published. And you can maybe imagine, with the amount of words that he writes, how stressful that was. I'm here to tell you, you don't have to be just like Brandon. Nobody who's published but him produces like that. No one. However, it served me really well trying, so I'm not complaining. My debut novel came out from Henry Holt in 2012. I think I said that, Chasing the Skip. My agent is Eddie Schneider at Jabberwocky. Wonder who I knew there. I'm actually gearing up to self-publish several contemporary YA novels this year, and then next year I may follow them with my science fiction depending on how it goes in New York. So I'm kind of in this gonna be hybrid place. So if you have questions about that, I'll take those at the end. We'll talk about YA during the lecture. I love discussion though, and questions. I don't want to listen to myself talk for an hour and a half because my voice will leave me. So if you have questions and comments, please raise your hands. I'm happy to have discussion. Okay. All right, so let's talk about young adult. How many of you are writing young adult? Or have written young adult? Okay. Looks like a little over a third of you. Young adult, a lot of times people think of it as an audience. It's not really an audience as much as a genre about adolescence. And this should resonate with you if you're writing science fiction and fantasy. You know that readers of genres have genre expectations. And so that's most of what I'm going to talk about today, or what are the expectations of your audience when you are writing young adult. When you're trying to break in, your primary audience is going to be editors. If you look like you don't understand the genre when you send the work to the editor, they're going to reject you because they're going to feel like this doesn't have a place, we don't know where to shelve this, we don't know what you're trying to do. And then after that, readers. Readers in young adult have expectations, just like readers in science fiction and fantasy. And it's important to meet those expectations if you want to write in the genre. Mostly we're going to talk about character, because that's most of where the genre expectations fall in YA. As you can imagine, a genre about adolescence is very character-based genre, because adolescence is a character thing, right? It's where your character is, and it defines the character issues. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But let's talk about mechanics. So who can give me a definition of young adult? What's young adult literature? Go for it. So what age?
Isn't it under 18? Is it 14 to 18?
14 to 18. That's pretty good. The readers are 12 to 18. The characters are 14 to 18, because on the lower end, you go 2 years older. Your character should be 2 years older than your audience. That's not as true when you get older. A character who's 16 could be a book for a 16-year-old, but on the lower end, that is true. Yeah?
Publishers tend to want around like 8,000 words for a YA book.
You mean 80,000?
Oh, sorry, that's what I meant. 80,000.
Not 8,000.
Sorry.
Yeah, that is true. That was actually the next thing I had on my list. Somewhere between 50 and 80 is really good. If your book is between 50 and 80, you're not going to hear any complaints. 50 and 80,000 words. If it's shorter, you might be able to get away with it. Chasing the Skip is 42,000 words. It may actually be shorter because that was the count before I did galleys, and every time I touched that book, it got shorter. I sold it, my agent accepted it at 50,000. I sold it at, I think, about 45, and now it's 42, and I didn't hear any complaints. But when you're sending things out, 50K is a good place to shoot for. If you can probably sell something between 90 and 100, but you're pushing it and longer than that, editors are not going to want to see that from a debut author. Some of it's about shelf space, right? Some of it is just about the expectations of the genre are that your books are shorter. Things to know about the audience: 90% of the audience for young adult is female. So when you walk into the bookstore and you see the sea of pink and purple, it's because they're marketing to that 90% female audience. I've also heard 50% of the audience is adult. So again, we're not talking about an audience here. We are talking about writing for teenagers, but only 50% of your actual readers will be teenagers. A lot of them are adults. And I think that's probably because of the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is that young adult novels are fast-paced. There are no boring parts in young adult novels, or there shouldn't be, because teenagers will not let you bore them. And this is probably why adults are so attracted to it, because readers, like books that move. And so you want to get in, tell your story, and get out. You want to begin where your tension begins and end as soon as your tension ends. This isn't the genre for long prologues, if there even is in existence a genre for this. This isn't the genre for long prologues that go on and on and on before you get to the action. You probably can't sell that in any genre, but definitely not in young adult. Because of that, because you want your books to move, this is true of every genre as well, but especially in young adult, you want your scenes to all advance character and plot and setting, if applicable magic, relationships between characters. You want your scenes to work really hard for you and pack them with multiple purposes. That's really true all the time, but especially in young adult, you need to be moving, your characters need to be progressing, and so you want to make sure that every scene is working as hard for you as you can possibly make it. A lot of what I'm going to say today is generalizable to most fiction. So if you're not writing YA, don't feel like none of this applies to you, because really, whenever you're writing, you want to make all your sentences, all your paragraphs, all your scenes, all your books do as much as they possibly can, because it helps engage your readers. And that's the goal, is to engage your readers. That's the goal of all writing. The good news about YA is that it's thriving in a way that a lot of other parts of publishing aren't. It's a good place to break in, because not to say that if you're not writing YA you should go write it because it's a good place to break in, but if it's where your voice falls and it's what you want to do, a lot of debut authors get picked up in YA. That's not as true in all segments of publishing. So it's a good place to be. Let's talk about characters. The first, most fundamental thing, I hear a lot of times people will say, I don't know if my book is YA. Maybe it's middle grade, maybe it's adult, I don't know, right? And the first question I always ask is, well, is your main character a teenager? This is pretty much, there's two things I'm going to talk about that are pretty hard and fast rules. Most of what I'm going to say is true most of the time. This is always true. Young adult is from the perspective of a teenager. I kind of covered that before, but your character should be between the ages of 14 and 18. If they're not, that's a big red flag for editors. It's not about a teenager. How can it be about adolescence? It's probably not young adult. The second most important thing is that it's from the point of view of the teenager right now. It's not about the adult looking back at when they were a teenager. A book, I'm not sure exactly how old the protagonist is in The Secret Life of Bees. She may be younger, but it's about a young girl. But it's very much told from an adult perspective, looking back on when she was a young girl. And so it's an adult book. And so if you're taking this kind of retrospective tone with your book, that's not going to fit very well in YA. That's probably adult. Okay. Yeah?
Does character gender, like as the main character, if it's guy or girl, does that change anything?
I have heard, and I've had some friends experience this, that it's difficult to sell a book that has a male protagonist. Obviously, it can be done. There are books that have male protagonists, but especially male-centered romance is kind of a hard sell. There were a lot of in the whole paranormal romance genre, which is a little bit dead now. But when it was big, I had a friend try to sell a book with a male protagonist, and they all said, well, we can't sell this because boys don't read this. Girls will read books with male protagonists even more so than men will read books with women protagonists, so I'm not sure, but that it is a harder sell to sell a book with a male protagonist. Are there other questions? Yeah?
Why is 90% of the audience female?
Oh, who knows, right? I mean, if the publishers knew why, then they would pull in the other 50% of the population, right? I think it's cyclical. Like if I was going to take a guess at it, I think it's because a lot of the people who were writing at the beginning of the genre were women. A lot of the characters were women. A lot of the readers were women. So editors started marketing to those women, and the women told their friends, and the marketing was pushing toward that demographic, and it just spread. That would be my guess. Obviously, I mean, people like John Green. John Green is like, this is the mecca of YA publishing. Everybody wants to be John Green, and he's male, and many of his protagonists are male. However, I haven't actually read The Fault in Our Stars, but I believe that one The protagonist is female. And that's the one that did the best, sales-wise. So, I don't know. Were there other questions at this point? Awesome. Okay. One of the awesome things about writing about teenagers is that the young age allows you to do so much growth with these characters. You can start with characters who don't know very much about the world and grow them up really fast without having people have negative feelings at the beginning because your character doesn't know enough, right? If we have an adult who's really naive, that's going to have a lot of negative connotations for readers. Whereas a 14-year-old who's really naive, that's just normal, right? One of the reasons I love young adult is that it gives me an excuse to have the character encountering things for the first time, right? First love is the most exciting to write about because your character is dealing with all of these things for the very first time and they have no experience, which isn't to say that young adult characters shouldn't be competent. Your character should be competent because competent characters get more sympathy from the reader. Readers like competent characters, but they can be competent and inexperienced. You can let them solve problems with their competence and then create problems for them with their inexperience, which is really exciting from a writer perspective when you're trying to figure out where you're going to derive tension in your book. Your main character's inexperience and their youth is a great source of tension. And if you're like me, you're always looking for more of those because packing your book with the most tension possible will keep your readers turning pages. Voice is also really key. And this is kind of an intangible thing. I tried to write an adult novel once, and the comment I just kept getting was, "This sounds like YA." What does that mean, this sounds like YA? My character was not a teenager, but my voice, because I had spent so long writing teenagers, my voice sounded like a teenager. That's not something that I can tell you mechanically how to do, but it's something that with practice you have to learn how to do, is to make your voice sound like an authentic teenager. When I wrote a middle grade novel a couple of years ago, and I tried to write it in first person, which is what I normally write in, and I was writing this 10-year-old boy, and he sounded like a 16-year-old girl. It was awesome. So I wrote the book in third person because I could break out of my well-honed 16-year-old girl voice because it was totally inappropriate to that novel. But honing that voice so that your book sounds and feels like a teenager, like YA, is an important part of writing in the genre. A good example, I figure most of you have probably read Brandon's books. Is this a fair assessment? Most of us have read Brandon's books. I won't spoil things, especially on the one that just came out. But if you think about the difference between David in Steelheart and Shallan and Kaladin in The Way of Kings, they're all teenagers, right? But David speaks like a teenager. Kaladin, I keep forgetting that he's only 19, right? He sounds like an adult. And part of it is the voice. Part of it is because he has more experience, right? We open with Kaladin at the beginning of the book, and he's a soldier, and he's in battle, and he's good at it. That's not something that you're likely to encounter as much in YA. Probably that scene is actually from the perspective of another character who is in that battle, I believe, for the first time. He's relatively new and very afraid, and that's much more a young adult perspective. If that character were in young adult, he would be new and probably terrified because he's in a battle, but you know, it's cool. Another wonderful thing about young adult is, I love YA, I don't know if you can tell, is that adolescence is a period of time in which emotions have a lot of intensity. And this is a really positive thing for main characters. You want your main character to be feeling intense things because you want the reader to be feeling intense things, and the character is the portal for the reader to get into your story. And so not every young adult book is full of angst, but you know, a lot of them are, and it's very appropriate to the genre. And it's good news for tension, because if you can make the reader really get behind that emotion, where you run into problems is when it's melodramatic, and melodramatic things are when the reader does not agree with the intensity of the emotion, right? The reader is not feeling it. That's a problem. But when you can get the reader behind that emotional intensity and get them to recall their adolescence and how much these things hurt, and how the joy of first love and the pain of loss that you feel when you're a teenager, when you're developing those emotions, when these things are happening to you for the first time, if you can get the reader behind that, that's gold, right? They will continue to turn pages and then pick up your next book, which is what we want. One thing that I hear a lot, I see in unpublished young adult fiction, sometimes we end up with this perspective where the writer is kind of looking down on the teenagers. You don't want to write teenagers the way you see them from an adult perspective. You want to write teenagers the way that teenagers see themselves, because that's what's going to make them read your book, right? And they're 50% of the audience. And if you think about it, when you're 17, you don't necessarily feel like the awkward dork that you are, right? Sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And you need to hit this medium place where you're not insulting your audience. Teenagers actually have a lot more in common with adults than children do with adults. If you think about it, teenagers were adults, right? Teenagehood is a construct that didn't exist like 100 years ago. This didn't exist. Teenagers had jobs and families, and and maybe they weren't great at it, but some of us in our 20s are not that great at it, right? Thinking of them as closer to adults than children is a good perspective to have when you're writing for teenagers, because if you insult them, they will put down your book and never pick it up again. We already talked about competence. Okay, if you're writing young adult, I would strongly suggest that you take a adolescent development class. There's one here, and it used to be the MFHD department, but I think they've changed the name. But the human development department here, there's an adolescent development class, because the stages of development in adolescence are great sources of tension. If you think about it, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sorts of things that teenagers are going through. Think about it, as I talk about this, think about the ways that you could use this in a book to add more layers of tension to your story, right? Maybe your story isn't about these things, but if your character is going through conflicts that are unrelated to your plot, you're adding layers of nuance and layers of purpose to your book, right? So teenagers are establishing identity, asking who they are. They're navigating important transitions and rites of passage. This is a great place to get nervousness and anxiety about the future as they're going through transitions and rites of passage. Fear of the future. They're trying to establish roots, but if you think about how volatile life is when you're in high school, how quickly people move away and people graduate and your life is changing, the roots slip away because everything is changing so fast, and there's this knowledge that when you turn 18, you're not going to see these friends anymore. You're going to end up scattered all over the country. This is less true if you're doing like high fantasy and you're in a different setting. Some of these are more generalizable to that than others, but certainly if you're writing a contemporary setting, that's definitely true. Teenagers are working on choosing a life path, right? Thinking about potential careers, figuring out what they think about the world, what their political ideologies are. This is the stage of life where we start to develop identity in politics, in education, potential careers, those sorts of things. This one is huge, establishing relationships with peers. Teenagers are trying to figure out how they relate to others. And it's awkward, right? It's so much fun to write awkward teenagers. This is probably my favorite thing. I'm so sadistic. All right. One thing that happens during the teenage years is that gender typing increases. So hopefully as adults, we're mostly aware that men and women are not that different, right? We're all people, and maybe there are some differences, but for the most part. But during the teenage years, teenagers are very concerned about what guys are like and what girls are like, and how if you're a girl, you're very concerned about what guys like as a group, right? And misunderstandings that happen there are great sources of tension because you can't predict what will happen on an individual level based on what happens in a group level, right? Peer groups are really tightly structured and they're really volatile. There's tons of politicking and power struggles between friends. Friendships are constantly beginning and ending. Romantic relationships are beginning and ending. Teenagers are worried about conformity and social pressure, making social mistakes, breaking up and healing relationships. Offenses between friends can be huge because everybody is emotionally volatile, right? And so we expect that adults can work out their problems rationally. When you're dealing with these sorts of problems for the very first time, people aren't rational, right? And when you're dealing with them for the very first time on top of growth hormones, people are really not rational, right? And you can mine that for tension. Certainly dating, learning to negotiate attraction and sex drives and sex. We'll talk about that. What's the place of sex in young adult? It'll be very salacious. It's awesome. Differentiating from parents, a really big source of tension. Starting to see their parents as people and imperfect people. The stereotype is that all teenagers hate their parents, which can get really old really fast if you just jump to that every time you write a teenager. But starting to see their parents as people and trying to navigate those relationships, and that's an evolving relationship. At the beginning of adolescence, you have one relationship with your parents, and by the end, you have a totally different one, which, look at that, it's a character arc, right? We have these in real life, and it's a character arc. It's exciting. They're dealing with choices and consequences and freedom and responsibility. Dealing with serious social issues like substance abuse, addiction, sexual abuse, broken homes, gangs, violence, these sorts of things. In middle grade, you generally don't touch on those issues, or if you do, you touch on them very lightly. In young adult, those things are, they sell really well. Issues novels sell really well, which isn't to say that you should write a book about an issue, but teenagers are really dealing with these things in their real lives, and so if your characters are dealing with them in your book, it's just reality, right? So you can think about those things and how you can use them to raise the tension in your existing story. You don't want to just you don't want to throw all of those in, right? But they're the sorts of things that your characters might be going through on top of whatever you're making them go through in the plot that can help you to have a more nuanced book. Do you have questions and comments about that? I'm talking a lot. My voice is getting tired. Nobody has any questions? All right. Leaving me alone up here. All right. So let's talk about sex. What is the place of sexual content in young adult? What do you think?
I think the place is probably the protagonist is asking themselves that same question about their life.
Ah, that's a really good comment. He said, probably the protagonist is asking themselves that same question about their life. Certainly, the protagonist, unless there's a reason why they're not, in which case that's probably an issue in your book also, right? Your main character is probably asking themselves, what is the place of sex in my life? I get asked this question a lot. How far can the sexual content go? Young adult, you do not see graphic, in-scene erotic sex. Pretty much if it's not graphic, in-scene erotic sex, you can find it in YA. There's a lot of sex scenes that go right up to, we have the fade to black. There's plenty of fairly graphic, awkward sex in young adult, lots of that. So really the barrier, unless you're writing erotica, in which case you're probably not selling that in young adult, really it's about what you're comfortable with. I have never heard or had anyone tell me that I should have more sex in my books. I've never had an editor comment that I need to have less either. And I do have some sexual content. I'm writing a novel, this one hasn't gone out in New York yet, but I'm writing a novel that's about a girl whose mother is infertile and has just been desperately trying to have more children for 7 years. And this has been such a strain on their home. She's 16, she decides she's gonna get pregnant so her mother can have a baby. There's sex in that book, right? There's no way I can dodge the fact that there is sex in that book because it's important to the arc. And that's what I would recommend with sexual content in young adult, is that if it's there, it needs to be important to the story. That's not necessarily true of every book that's published in young adult, but it's a good guideline that if the sex is part of your issue, you have to touch it, you have to cover it, you can't dodge it or you're not doing justice to your story. I don't think I said that very well. I think that was maybe a little bit of an innuendo. Oh well. However, if it's not important to your story, don't feel like you need to throw it in because those editors in New York want more sex in their books. Especially in fantasy, a lot of fantasy has much lower sexual content. It's not true across the board, but a lot of it has much lower sexual content than the contemporary stuff. Do you have comments, questions? Okay. Okay. If I could teach you one thing about teenage characters, if I could go back and tell myself this 10 years ago, this is the thing that I would want you to take away today. Whiny characters are not sympathetic. If you think about whining, it doesn't further your plot because nothing is happening. Whiny people don't do things, right? At least not at the time that they're whining. It's not really furthering your character because if you haven't already seen the thing that they're whining about, you're not feeling sympathy for them anyway. If you have already seen the thing, you've seen it. So it's not establishing new character things. Whining, all it does is make your reader annoyed. I have a no whining policy now with my characters. I didn't for a long time. I did not realize that I would just let my characters whine, and people hated them. And I was like, why do you hate my characters? But this was why. It was because I let them whine. If you think about it, back to a Brandon Sanderson example, Elkahar in The Way of Kings is not very sympathetic. And why? Because he whines. He probably has more power than anybody else in that book, but he whines constantly. And it makes him unsympathetic. So if you want to make a character unsympathetic, whining is a great way to do it. Which is not to say that teenagers don't whine, but you don't need to necessarily make your book like a photorealistic version of a teenager. You want it to be a version of a teenager that you want to spend time with. And we don't want to spend lots of time around people who are whining. In addition, pain is yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Well, I found that like characters that I find sympathetic, other people will think are really whiny, and characters that I think are whiny, other people will think they're totally sympathetic. What's your rule on how to make it like, oh, this bad thing is happening, they're acknowledging the bad thing, but they're not whining about it? Like, I
Okay.
Harry Potter in the fifth book, and a lot of people don't. So,
I did find him very whiny. My rule is, if you think about it, when we see someone go through something painful and they don't whine about it, that's an admirable trait, right? When we see somebody go through something that maybe we don't think is painful and they whine about it, that's a negative trait. If they go through something hard that we acknowledge is hard and they whine about it, that's a neutral trait, right? This is really subjective. You know, I hear the same thing. Like, there's books where I don't think the protagonist is whiny, but other people do. One thing that's really helpful for me, especially in relationships with parents with teenage characters, is if you can develop some empathy within your character for other people, that helps a lot. Characters who just think everything that everyone else does is horrible get really old after a while. And it's very easy to be sarcastic. It's very easy to cultivate kind of this, my character complains about everything and is witty and just, you know, cuts everybody down. And there's a place for that. There's a place for those characters. But if that's all your character ever does, you're hitting the same note over and over and your reader gets tired. If you make them not whine and then they have a complaint, we're a lot more likely to, just because of the juxtaposition, we're a lot more likely to think that their complaint is valid than if they hit that same note all the time.
How do you balance competence and likability? Like, you can have someone be competent at something, but then if it's too different for the scene or too different for the thing, it's not reasonable to have a teenager be like this prodigy who's like, I designed a spaceship, let's fly in our spaceship. But how do you balance that? Okay,
so the question is, it's not realistic to have teenagers be competent at everything, so how do you handle making them still likable? Yeah. That's the question. One thing that you can do is make them competent at something, right? I have the novel that I have out on sub right now in New York is about shape-shifting spies. They can change into other human forms, and they're corporate spies. And my main character is not very competent in her social relationships. She's, you know, in love with this boy, and this is not like, she's kind of awkward. She's not very good at that. But she's really competent at aspects of her job and incompetent at others. Right, she's really good at replicating voices. She's not so good at some other things. The book opens with her trying to fool an eye scanner, and she's terrible at it. People are a mix of strengths and weaknesses. And so if you can show your character being competent at some things, then we're cool with them being incompetent at others, right? We don't feel like you're an incompetent person. A character we feel you're an incompetent person is a character who isn't good at anything. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Do you have other questions at this point? Let me figure out where I was. All right, no whining. Okay, sometimes making your protagonist sympathetic can be really hard. This is true. I'm not saying it's hard to make teenagers likable. It's hard to make characters likable sometimes. For example, I was talking about my teen pregnancy novel. So I've got this 16-year-old girl who wants to be pregnant. This is a terrible idea, guys, right? This is a terrible idea. But I have to get through a third of this book with the reader not being like, this is a terrible idea, Chuck, right? The character goes about this by, she knows in the back of her head her boyfriend will never agree with this. They're not even really together, and so this is not a good idea. So she basically fools him into sleeping with her. And so that's not a very likable thing, right? This is not very likable. So you can take your not very likable traits and balance them with more likable traits. What I did with her is I made her home situation so bad that you really can feel why she would have this empathy with her mother and want to do this so honorable thing of giving her mother a baby, right? Trying to serve her mother is a likable thing, right? Also, you can play with information flow. Like, she really means to tell her boyfriend, right? She's gonna tell him, and then, she doesn't. But somebody who plans not to tell their boyfriend that is a lot less likable than someone who really meant to and whoops, right? So you can play with this balance, and what's gonna be most instrumental for you, I'm sure you talk about this a lot in this class, is your writing group. You need to put this in front of readers. You need to put your character in front of readers and have them tell you if they like your characters and why. They will probably not be able to tell you how to fix it. But when more than one reader is saying, I don't like your character because, you really need to pay attention to that and work on the balance. I'm working on a revision right now where one of the characters, my readers really did not like her, and I'm going through and just softening her dialogue. That's it. I'm not changing the plot. But she said some really harsh things, and it made the readers be like, why are these two people friends? And I'm like, that's really legitimate. I wouldn't want to be friends with someone who talked to me like that either. So it's not always huge fixes. But going through and paying attention to where your beta readers are on board and where they're not is really positive. Other things you can do to make your character sympathetic. We talked about competence. Another thing that goes a long way is charisma. Somebody who is entertaining to read about, I'm willing to give a lot more mileage of them doing not nice things than somebody who's not, somebody with a really sharp and entertaining, charismatic voice. Also, I'm more willing to let my character go along with people who are maybe kind of sketchy when they're being really charismatic to the character. A good example of that is Zane in Mistborn, right? Zane's kind of psychotic, but he's so charismatic. Like, I like Zane. I don't want to hang out with him, but I want Vin to hang out with him so that I can hang out with him. That's cool from a long distance. Ooh, psychotic. Also, people who love and care about other people are sympathetic. I don't know, I couldn't think of a Brandon example for this one, but I just read J.R. Johansson's Insomnia, which is a really good YA book that came out last year. The main character, the magic system is that he enters other people's dreams. The last person he made eye contact with, he goes into their dream every night, and so he's getting no sleep, and so he's dying of sleep deprivation. And so he's kind of psycho, and he's your viewpoint character, and he's a little bit psychotic, but he has these two friends who are so wonderful, and he really loves them. And because he loves them, I love him. And so you can get some of that. This is what happens in Firefly. In the pilot, they have Kaylee come up and say, oh, I love my captain, right? This line is there because the studio said Mal is unlikable, right? So what do? They have Kaylee, who is so sweet, love him. Now we like him that's sort of the reverse of what I was talking about. People who don't like anyone, it's really hard to like. People who love somebody, even if it's not everybody, are a lot more likable, particularly if we can see what they see in those people and say, I love those people too. That's really helpful for getting people on board with your characters and their motivations. Do you have questions about that? About character? It's kind of the end of my character spiel. I have more stuff about YA, but anything? Yeah?
What do you throw over into adult fiction if you're also using them books?
A lot of what I said is just basics of good fiction, right? The difference when you have young characters, the difference is usually some of it's the developmental issues, right? If you have teenage characters like Kaladin or Shallan who aren't necessarily dealing with adolescent issues, they just happen to be teenagers, that's definitely more adult. Erotica is definitely more adult. There was something else I was going to say. I'm trying to remember what it was. Things that are adult. I've lost it. Sorry, it'll come back to me. Yeah,
I wanted to go back to whining just a little bit.
go for it.
If you have a person who whines, but that doesn't stop them from what they're doing, so they're like, oh, this situation is so horrible, and they kind of feel sorry for themselves, but that doesn't stop them from trying to resolve it. Do you think that helps to balance it out a bit?
That was the problem I had, is I had characters who were not necessarily inactive, but they just complained at every step, and it was really grating for people. It doesn't mean you can do anything if you do it well enough. I couldn't sell it.
Thief, it's one of the whiniest characters I've ever read, the Queen's Thief series.
Okay.
He's super likable because he's very competent, he's extremely charismatic, and carries it.
And some of it may be the nature of whining. I haven't read that, but if you have whining that's entertaining,
It's very
that's a big, anytime you're entertaining your reader, they will put up with whatever rule you're breaking, right? Most of what I'm saying is what you should look at if you're having problems. If you're doing something and it's not what I'm talking about, I mean, beyond like age of character and things, if you're trying to sell a 20-year-old in YA, don't do that. But most of the rest of it, you don't need to worry about unless you're hearing, I don't like your character. Your character doesn't sound like a teenager, you know, those sorts of things. Then you might want to look at these issues and say, maybe it's because my character whines. But since I had that weakness for so long, for me, no whining, never. I try not to write it, and then when I write it anyway, I cut it out. Yeah.
So, I'm working on like a coming of age like series, and so the character starts pretty young, but there are some like sophisticated themes that are more for like YA. So what would you suggest with that?
When you say pretty young, what do you mean by
So
pretty
he
young?
starts at 10,
And then how old is he at the end of the series?
18.
Okay, that's not easy to sell.
Yeah.
It's way easier to sell an adult. And it depends on how serious your themes are. Are your themes adult themes, or is it focused on adolescence? If it's focused on adolescence, you probably want to do everything in your power to move them up to 13 or 14. Like if it really has to be 10, but if you can move them up, it'll be so much easier for you to sell if the character starts at 14.
Okay, cool.
Other things? Okay. Let's talk about plot. Young adult novels can be about anything. But the most important thing is it is your teenager who drives the action. This is not easy to do, especially if you're doing a contemporary setting. But really anything with contemporary sensibilities, which many high fantasy settings have, anything with contemporary sensibilities, it's not easy to take people who are not socially empowered and empower them in the plot. But that's good news because it means you have plenty of forces for your character to push against. Obviously, one of those major forces is their parents. The dead parent backstory is a YA cliche, but it still gets done, even though it's cliche, because you have to get rid of the parents as a force that will stop your character from acting. It doesn't mean they have to be dead. Sometimes just the conflict with the parents works fine. I think even more than the two dead parent backstory, you see the one dead parent backstory because often the parents would serve the same purpose in the story, and having two characters that serve the same purpose is really clunky. And so you see a lot of one parent protagonists so that they only have one parent they have to push against, so that you don't have too much repetition and you don't have these parents who feel like this like parent glob, that they're really the same person, right? But you have to get around the parents somehow. Sometimes the parents are clueless, sometimes the parents are in the way, but you definitely have to deal with that. What I do whenever I come up with an idea for a novel, because I write young adult, my first question to myself is, where am I going to put a teenager in this? Chasing the Skip is about bounty hunters. And I got the idea for this book. I was talking to my husband about bounty hunters. I knew that they exist, like not like in the Old West, like now. And I was like, how does that work? And so I looked it up, and it's really fascinating, the place of bounty hunting in our justice system. It's kind of awesome. And I was like, I want to write about this. This is great, and people don't know like how it works, and that's wonderful. But where do I put a teenager in that, right? My teenager is not a bounty hunter. And so I thought, okay, maybe her dad is the bounty hunter. What father in their right mind brings his teenage daughter along on bounty hunting runs, right? This doesn't happen. Huh?
Maybe he's just terrible at it.
Maybe he's terrible at it. Well, what I did was I had her mother abandon her. She doesn't live with her father and has never lived with her father, and her mother just disappears. And so her father really has no choice. He has to go pick her up. And he really needs some money so that he can get an apartment, and so he has to keep working because he's now got this daughter to take care of, and so he's in kind of this bad situation, and so he brings his teenage daughter along bounty hunting. And now because I've set up the situation so that the characters are under pressure, I can get away with doing some things, putting a teenager in a place where they normally wouldn't be. And then of course she develops a crush on the guy that he's chasing, which kind of lights the whole situation on fire. It's really fun to write. And so it's a good frame of mind to have. How are you going to make your teenager able to be the agent in the story? How are you going to structure your story so that it can be affected and changed by your teenage character? It's really important that they can, because otherwise they're not the protagonist of the story, right? The protagonist of the story is the one who is the agent of the arc and the agent of the change. And so you have to figure out how you're going to accomplish that. Do we have questions about that? Comments? You guys are so quiet. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit more about the agent of change in the story? I don't really, I mean, I guess I've always been like, okay, protagonist, protag, right? But there's
Right.
so many people that do things.
Okay.
So
Good. So when you're structuring a book, whether it's when you're outlining, if you're an outliner, or when you're revising once you have your glob of stuff. I'm kind of halfway of each. I'm an outliner, but then I also write really messy first drafts that I have to restructure. But whenever you're doing your structural work on your book, whatever stage that is, you need to identify your narrative question, right? I didn't previously prepare. So in Mistborn, the narrative question is, can they overthrow the Lord Ruler, right? Vin is a teenager, but she's not a YA character. But let's just pretend that she is. If it were a YA book, then it would have to be her who solves the problem at the end. And it is her who solves the problem at the end, even though it's an adult book. You have to structure your plot so that when your narrative question is answered, it is answered by your teenager and not by somebody else. Does that make sense? So you ask yourself, what is the narrative question? And when you're working on your ending and how your ending is going to fulfill your narrative question, you need to make sure that your main character is able to be active enough. You want to put as much pressure on them as you can without stopping them from solving your narrative question. Because if somebody else solves the narrative question who is not your protagonist, that is really unsatisfying. Really unsatisfying for your reader. They want to see their hero succeed, not somebody else succeed on behalf of the hero. And when you're dealing with genres like dystopian and things where they're changing the whole world, this can be really difficult, right? Like, how is one teenager going to change the face of this society? And that's a problem you need to ask yourself when you're doing your plot structuring. How are you going to cause that to be possible for your character so that you can have a satisfying ending and have your teenager be legitimately the protagonist of the story?
One potential solution to that is in Steelheart, in which it's a teenager fighting against this overwhelming evil, and he gets help from everyone up to the point of the final battle. It's he who figures out how to actually win.
Well, he has the answer, right? Because he was there when the thing happened that give us the solution, right? And so that's why, you like that? And so that's why he's the legitimate protagonist of that story, is because he has this information that nobody else has, and he doesn't even know he has it, right? And so if you can give your teenager something that you want to have the plot be like a lock, and your protagonist has the key. And that can be really difficult when you're dealing with people who are socially unempowered, but when you accomplish it, it's really satisfying because you have these characters who shouldn't have been able to solve the problem, and they did it anyway. Do you have other comments or questions about that? Yeah?
I was gonna say that Harry Potter is kind of like that. Like, if Hermione had gone and killed Voldemort, if he got killed in some freak accident, it was like,
They used a gun.
Right. Or even worse, if Dumbledore solves everything, which if you read those books carefully, he should, right? I mean, he should, but he can't. He can't because that's not satisfying. It has to be the kids. It's got to be the kids. Which is, this is why the plot arc is that the mentor often gets killed off, right? That's the archetype, is that the mentor dies because the mentor cannot be allowed to solve the problems. And unless they're out of the way, and they don't have to die, but they have to get out of the way so that they can't solve the problems, so that your protagonist is the only one who can. Other things about that? Woohoo. Let's talk about theme. In middle grade, themes are really black and white. right? We have a lot of good versus evil in middle grade. In young adult, teenagers, like I said, have way more in common with adults than they have with children. They're ready to think in complex ways. Some young adult readers are really sophisticated. And they're ready to think about the world in shades of gray. So your villains can, and perhaps even should, be more gray than they are in middle grade. As can your protagonists. Your protagonists can do some pretty awful things as long as you can keep them sympathetic, as long as you can keep your readers on board with them. You don't need to feel like, love conquers all. It needs to be the theme of your book because teenagers can see through that, right? Like, if you think about it, at 16, you know the world's not a perfect place. You know that battles of good versus evil are not always so absolute. And you're free to explore that in young adult. YA books need to be about things that young adults care about. And so some of that goes back to the developmental list, right? The themes of your book often are derived from those developmental things that teenagers are going through because that's what makes your book be about adolescence. Let's see. But one key difference between, I won't say all of adult, but a lot of adult and young adult is that generally young adult books, at least at the ending, are fairly optimistic, right? Usually things end, if not perfectly, not tied up in a bow, not black and white, but fairly well. Things can get pretty dark, really dark sometimes, but we don't eliminate all hope in young adult. Like some genres of adult, things can get very, very dark. And there can be no hope and things can just be awful, and that's not generally done in young adult. There are exceptions. I don't know if anybody's read M.T. Anderson's Feed. There was another book called Feed recently by somebody else. Yeah, Mary Grant. But I'm talking about the M.T. Anderson one about the kids with the chips in their heads. That was a really dark book, and it ended with very little hope. It won a lot of awards. I don't think its sales were as good as they probably should have been. It was an awesome book. You should all go read it. Writing science fiction and fantasy, you should read Feed. But that one was pretty dark. But as a general rule, usually things end with hope. Even in the middle of series and things, generally you have an upbeat at the end, usually. Let's talk about vulgar content. What about swearing? Do people swear in young adult books?
Never.
Never, right? Do teenagers swear? So here's my spiel about this. There are 2 F words in my book, some other swear words as well. I'm writing about, the male counterpart to my protagonist, I'll put it that way. It's not a romance. But the guy that my character has this crush on is a convict, right? And he swears, and I thought that was realistic, right? And I still think that was realistic, and I think that was a legitimate artistic choice. My editor said nothing about it. In fact, after the fact, she sent me this email like, Scholastic wants to know where to put your book. Are there swear words in it? And I'm like, yes, there are swear words in my book. Is that clock like way? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it is. Okay, awesome. So my editor didn't care. My agent, I've actually been told that no one will ever tell you this in New York, but my agent did tell me I should put more swear words in the book. I don't think this is a common experience because of the number of times I've heard people say no one will ever do that to you, but my agent did, and he didn't tell me you have to. He said, it feels like you're censoring your characters, just let them swear, is what he said. And that was fine, and it's published like that. However, this is my warning. This is my sad regret. I've gotten a lot of emails from friends who say, I love your book so much and I want to tell all my friends about it, but I'm afraid it will offend them because you have these swear words in there, so I can't recommend it to anybody. And that's just like, for a debut author, that's just like a knife to your heart, right? Where is my word of mouth, guys? And so it is likely that I will get my rights back to my book sometime next year, and I will republish it because that's what you do. Self-publishing is great for that. You can keep your things in print. And when I do, I won't change anything else about the book because, it's edited, it's done. But I am going to pull out the swear words because it was not worth it to me. I still feel like I made a legitimate artistic choice, but now, on the other side of that choice, I look at it and I say, was that the only way I could have created that sense about that character? No. I could have worked harder and come up with something else, right? And so was it worth the loss of sales from the loss of people telling their friends about this book because they don't feel comfortable with swearing in books? It was not worth it. And especially coming from a place where I'm an LDS author, and so a lot of my first group of readers, my first network, a lot of them are LDS and a lot of them are very conservative. It was a poor decision on my part in terms of marketing and in terms of getting my work in front of people. And it doesn't really matter if I made a good artistic choice if nobody reads it, And so that's my sad cautionary tale about that. But everybody makes their own choice there, and editors aren't going to stop you. They may, if you're writing in another world, sometimes contemporary swear words look really out of place. And you have this wonderful excuse to make up new swear words, right? Like, if you put an actual swear word everywhere they say storms in the Stormlight Archive, holy cow, right? Like, the book would be so thick with, but it doesn't feel offensive to modern readers. Maybe it would feel offensive to someone from that world, but it doesn't feel offensive to your actual readers because it's not a swear word that offends them, right? And so that's great. Do you have comments about that? Yeah.
I've heard before that like a lot of writers that are nationally famous and stuff do really bad in Utah when they live from Utah. That they've done way better on that. I have friends that are artists too, but you can't sell anything in Utah, but then they do in the national market.
That's certainly true in art. It's really art. Utah is a terrible market for visual art.
I know how I used to think about people that swore, and I don't think that way anymore.
But Utah, no matter, even if you're not from here, Utah is a huge market for book buyers. It's like New York, California, Utah, right? Like, it's huge. A lot of readers, because the literacy rates are really high here. And so it's probably not smart to offend all of your conservative readers if the only thing that's offensive to them is your swear words, right? If your content is all going to be offensive to them too, then who cares, right? They're not going to read your book anyway. But if the only thing that's offensive to them is your swear words, you probably want to think about whether that's worth it to you. And maybe it is, and if it is, that's fine. I mean, I made that choice, right? I regret it now. Other things? Yeah.
Do you think of those same friends, because like you had the F word 2 times in your book, do you think it was specifically the extreme swears that offended him?
I have been told specifically by many people that it was that word.
Okay, so like throwing in the occasional damn is.
I struggle because I don't necessarily think of that as a swear word. Like sometimes people think things are swear words that I don't think are swear words. But yeah, no, I have had people tell me specifically it was that word, that was really offensive. And I mean, they say I threw it in at the end. I used it toward the end because it was an escalation, right? Like, I didn't throw it in without thinking. I thought, I was using it as a tool, but maybe it wasn't the most appropriate tool if I wanted to hang on to my audience. And we're talking about my audience, which is not necessarily the same as everybody else's audience. But you want your audience to be as wide as you can, still telling the story that you want to tell, right? And some books are for niche audiences, and that's fine, but you want to not eliminate people without necessity, because the bigger your audience is, the bigger your sales have the potential to be.
It sounds kind of bad, but sometimes the way I tell it looks like not one of those flaky Utah, because they swear, and I'm like, oh good, I better read this.
Maybe I'm attracting other people with my...
One of those Mormon market books where they've got an agenda behind it, and it's real flaky.
But don't feel like lack of swear words is just a Mormon thing, right? There's plenty of books that are not written by Utah authors who don't have swear words in them. Plenty of them. Yeah.
So when you're talking about swear words and choosing, like, in a different world, talking about Brandon's books and storms and all of these, which I think is awesome. But I also noticed that he threw in some normal swear words too, and I wonder how you would think about that and differentiate and say, okay, when can I make a choice to bring in an actual swear word?
You should ask Brandon that question because I don't do that. So I can talk about like what the effect of what, but I have no idea why he sometimes uses. I mean, and he only uses minor things I don't even think about as swear words, guys. I'm going to be honest. But that's a good question for him. I'd like to know the answer. Other things? Yeah.
I have a question going back to the ending of the books or plots. end on a cliffhanger that is a cliffhanger without being like, everything's great, but in the next book something will happen, but everything's still great. Like, how do you, I don't know.
So the question is, when you're dealing with a series of books, how do you leave some things open and still have a satisfying conclusion? I think that a lot of that goes back to narrative question. If you're doing a series of books, you should have a narrative question for the series and a narrative question for your book, for each book. And the narrative question for each book should be the prominent thing probably at the beginning, so that your reader knows this is the question that will be answered, and then at the end you answer it, and they feel like they've had something satisfying, and the other question you've raised can continue. So you give them some things that are satisfactory, and you can let other things dangle. And you can do that. I mean, there are books that don't even have endings, and you'll lose some readers over that if you're in a series and your book doesn't have an ending, but you obviously won't lose all of them because some books do it. So a lot of it just depends on how well you accomplish it.
I was just going to give Steelheart as a good example of that. There's the book question of dealing with Steelheart, we're trying to take down him, but then there's the narrative arc of where have these evil superheroes come from, how are we going to deal with the worldwide problem.
And if you want to look at something structurally fascinating, look at the Stormlight Archive, because how many sets and layers of arcs are in that book, right? The first two books, it turns out, are like the first act of this long, long story, and you can tell there's this long, long story, but each book also has its own arc, and there's an arc between the first and second book, and each of the books within, like there's the 5 parts in each book, each of those has an arc, and then all the scenes have an arc, right? And so there are narrative questions constantly being answered. So like, I want to read the next book, but I'm not like, why didn't you give me an ending? Right? Because so many questions have been answered and so many more have been raised. Don't try to do that. You can't sell that as a debut author, but, it's brilliant. Do you have other questions? I'm jealous of his ability to do that, if you can't tell. I have a hard time accomplishing my narrative arc over 50,000 words. I can't imagine over 500,000 words. All right, the last thing that I wanted to say about word choice and things is to watch out for slang. So you're in kind of this sticky place because you have to make your characters sound like teenagers, but if you use the words of the day, whatever they are, selfie or totes or whatever, your book gets dated before it's even published. When you're writing your book, it's not going to come out for at least 3 years, and that's if everything goes perfectly for you, right? If you don't have an agent. If you do have an agent, maybe it's only 2, right? Because of how long the process takes. And so, I mean, things that have permeated the entire culture, words like cool, right? Everybody says that. Odds are people are still going to be saying that in 10 years. Those sorts of things are fine, but you want to be really careful to try and cultivate an authentic voice, and it's a dance, while avoiding some of these more specific slang. If you're writing it in a specific subculture, someone used the example, I think it was Jessica J. George used the example of like surfer culture in California, and in a specific time period. Then you can use all the slang you want because it's not going to get dated because it's historical or it's niche. But when you're writing contemporary fiction for a general audience, you want to be especially careful you're not saying some of those things in another world. But if you're writing a contemporary setting, watch out for that, and watch out for new technologies. It's really sticky. I wrote a book, and my main character, this was before everybody had a cell phone. And then 4 years later, I was trying to revise it, and everyone's like, why doesn't she have a cell phone? People can't believe that a teenager would not have a cell phone. This was not an issue when I wrote it. And to some extent, this can't be avoided, right? You have to deal with cell phones if you're writing a contemporary setting. If your teenager doesn't have one, it needs to be an issue that they don't have one. Why don't they have one? Their parents won't let them have one. You have to address it. If you don't address it, your readers are not going to be happy. Everyone's going to be like, where's your cell phone? But, in 20 years when we all have Google Glass or chips in our heads or whatever, it's going to get dated anyway. But if you can avoid things like names of social networks, if you have to use it, you can. My agent always makes me pull all of that stuff out. I don't even write it anymore, I think. Every time I'm writing this, I'm like, Eddie's going to hate that. Backspace. Because it dates your book really quick. Things like names of video game consoles, right? If you were talking about the PS3 last year, it was fine. Now it's out of date. It's out of date already. And so it can be really tricky to talk about some of these things without dating yourself. And so you have to do kind of this dance and just decide where you want to be. The last thing I wanted to talk about, sometimes in science fiction and fantasy, there's a real bias against first person. That is not true in young adult. Definitely in science fiction and fantasy, there's a real bias against present tense, and that is not true in young adult. There are plenty of first-person present tense books. So first person present tense is really common. First person past tense and third person past tense are very common. So your epic fantasy readers will be like, people don't buy books in present tense, but it's not true. In YA, there's plenty of books. You have to be good at it, but that's true of whatever you do. So. Okay. Do we have questions? We're open to anything now. Yeah, in the back.
I've heard about new adult.
New adult. Do we know what new adult is? Should I define this? I'm seeing a lot of shaking of head. Okay. New adult, the basic thing you need to know about new adult, there's two things. One is that it's a genre about where YA is sort of this 14 to 18. It's like 18 to like 24, mid-20s. I'm not sure where they put the cap on that. So it's like the college age demographic. Thing you have to watch out for in new adult is that what it often means is erotica. And so especially if you're self-publishing and you put new adult on your book, you will get a lot of negative reviews if it is not erotica, because readers of new adult, a lot of them are looking for erotica. They're looking for the words new adult to mean erotica. I don't know where the genre is going to go. Hopefully it will open up and come to mean more things. But that's just something you have to be careful with when you say my book is new adult. It can be a totally legitimate thing to say, but a lot of people are going to hear my book is erotica. Just so you know, because that's where it sits now. But it's a really new genre and everything is still in flux. That might not be true in 2 years. Maybe it's already not true and I just haven't heard about it yet. Did that answer your question? Would you have other things you wanted to know about it? No? Okay, I had a hand up here.
I was wondering about something that's gone.
Okay, if it comes back to you, raise your hand again. I saw a hand in the back, yeah.
So you took this class in 04.
I did.
And you published your first book in
2012.
What was your process between then?
I wrote a lot of books.
How many hours a day or like weekly writing? What was it between then and now? What did you do like to improve and to get to where you are now?
Okay. My publication history. So I had written 2 books when I took that class in 2004. I wrote my first book in 2000, finished it in 2001. How many hours a day? I mean, it's been 14 years, right? So it varies. At this point, I work about 2 hours a day. I have a 2-year-old and manage a business. And my brain doesn't, I'm not a machine like some writers I know. My brain can't handle writing well for more than 3 or 4 hours a day tops. I write every day now. That's not always been the case. I say I've written 12 novels. That doesn't count, that's 12 distinct novels. That doesn't count all the times I rewrote from the ground up some of these books, some of them 3 and 4 times. So if you count the number of times I have written a novel, the number is probably twice that. I have been trying to break into New York for 14 years, sending things out. I got my agent, I actually have had 2 agents. I got my first agent in 2008, I believe. Might have been early 2007. And then I signed with Eddie, my current agent, in 2009. This industry is crazy, guys, and it's in real flux right now, especially with ebooks and with the bookstores closing and things. Everybody is scared and it's really hard to break in. And it's not fair not to tell you that. That's the truth. Good books will always sell, but not every good book will always sell. I'm looking now at indie publishing because I have all of these books that are pretty much done in New York for one reason or another. But I've written them, and there's no reason that they shouldn't, just because maybe they aren't going to hit #1 on the bestseller list and therefore maybe aren't a sure bet for editors, doesn't mean they're not good, and doesn't mean that an audience wouldn't like them, and doesn't mean that they can't have readers that could support me, especially if I don't have the overhead of a publisher. And so self-publishing is not the golden answer. People will tell you that, and it's just not true. But you really want to look at your options and your goals and figure out what would be best for you. I tried to get into New York for 14 years, and I'm still trying. I do not want to say I have not given up. But at this point in my career, I need to do something new. I need a new creative challenge, and so that's why I'm trying to go with the hybrid is the goal, right? You have to sell more books in New York in order to be hybrid. So we'll see how that goes. Did that answer your question? Do you have a more specific question?
I was more thinking about improving your writing,
The process of improvement.
becoming a better writer.
Writing groups are really key. I've had a weekly writing group for for 10 years. My first writing group grew out of this class. I did writing group with Isaac and Brandon for many years after that. I have a writing group now with several, we have published and unpublished authors in it. When you are networking, one of the most important things you can do, like when you go to conventions, I'm sure Brandon talks about that stuff, you are not there to meet professionals who are farther along in your career. You are there to meet your peers. Get to be friends with your peers. Make friends in this class. Go to LTUE and wherever else you can. Go to all the conventions you can and develop a peer group right now with the people who are on your same level, because they're the people who have time for you, frankly. Like published authors don't have time to be friends with everybody who likes their work and everybody. And in 10 years, your community will be mature. You know, Brandon wasn't Brandon Sanderson when I met him, right? He was, but he had sold Elantris. Nobody knew who he was. I signed up for that class. I had no idea who he was. No one in that class did, right? We're friends, and I'm friends with Brandon Sanderson. Why? Because I had a lot of friends who were on my level or just above. Brandon was like just above me. And now I find that whenever I need to do anything, I know somebody who knows about it and who has done it before me, because I have these friends who I've had for many years. And they're happy to help me because I'm their friend. You don't become friends with people to use their skills in the future, but you become friends with people for support and for friendship, and then you will use their skills in the future. And you will help other people out too. And it becomes this network of support, and everybody's trying to lift each other up, and this is how it's done, right? Professional jealousy is not helpful. You want your friends to succeed, and you want to do everything in your power to help your friends succeed, and then they will turn around and help you succeed, and it's beautiful. It is so wonderful to have a 10-year-old network. And so you want to establish that now so that you will have that in 10 years, because it will be instrumental for your career. And the beta reads that you get from your trusted readers will help you improve more than anything else. So you want to get feedback and listen to those people. Do we have other questions? I think we're close to the end. Pretty much done. We're good? All right, I think I'm supposed to tell you to bring your response papers up. Thank you.